Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the November webinar from the School of Education in Trinity College. And we're delighted today to be launching Dr. Joanne Banks' podcast on inclusion. And we have a wonderful set of panelists with us today to launch this, launch the podcast series, which is going to go live. And so I'm going to hand over to Joanne here to take over and lead the session for today. Thanks, Joanne.
And thank you, and thanks for organising this and for all your help throughout the day. You know what I'm talking about with various bits and pieces. Welcome everybody, and thanks for coming to this. It always encourages me how many people come to the sessions like this that we run, and how many people are interested in hearing about debates and tensions and issues in inclusive education. So I'd really welcome you to this webinar. I originally planned in the webinar to have excerpts from the podcasts that I've carried out over the past number of months. That was the plan, but I hadn't anticipated that the podcast interviewees would kindly accept my invitation to come to the event itself and speak. So my original plan went out the window. So I'm really happy to say that a number of the interviewees are here today, and we will have a nice open discussion about various things that cropped up during the different podcasts over the past while. So I'm just going to go through firstly, before I hand over to the panelists, maybe some insights into why I did this and why maybe to do a podcast. So for over a decade now, I've been working in the area of inclusive education, and I've been working in disability special education, primarily in the Irish context. And I suppose what I wanted to do was to create an alternative platform in which to discuss issues that I've been engaging with for that period of time. It's also a particularly crucial time in the Irish context. So from a policy perspective, Ireland is at a crossroads in relation to how it views special and inclusive education. And there's a lot of policy decisions probably going to be made over the next number of years. So another motivation of mine was to really gather the views of experts working in the field for many, many years, who could perhaps guide any decision that Ireland does make in how it approaches maybe special class provision, mainstream provision, and special schools, for example. Ireland recently ratified the UN CRPD. So I just thought that having an open discussion around inclusive education with international experts would be of value for that. There was a parallel reason for me, though, in that I am in Trinity now 2 years, and I run a couple of master's programs on inclusive education. And although my students are truly engaging with the topic, I felt that what better way to engage them would be to offer material that I'm getting them to read in an alternative format, so it might complement or in some cases supplement their academic reading. And I think a number of my students are here in the session today, and by all means there's a chat in operation there that Anne has told me she's going to keep an eye on. So if you'd like to offer your perspective, because I think the student voice today would be lovely to see how you experienced learning through these podcasts and how it impacted on your learning, which would be brilliant. So I just wanted to go into that a little bit more about the wider access that a podcast can offer. And really it falls within the Universal Design for Learning framework, where students can access material through multiple formats. And I think some of the academic articles can be hard to maybe access for some students, but also I think the podcasts in many ways can give a little opener or insight into where the academic is coming from before they venture into reading their work. So I think the more obvious thing for students is to engage them in their learning. But it was only a session or a meeting we had with Inclusion in Education and Society last week here in the School of Education, where we were talking about UDL for other stakeholders. So I would like to think that academics from all over will use these podcasts. They're freely available, and I think they'll really align nicely with perhaps the introduction to inclusive education modules or courses that are being run. But also for policymakers, don't always want to sit down, and they don't always want to read an academic journal article, and that perhaps listening to the podcast might give them an insight into the kind of theory and conceptual stuff around inclusive education, but the policy context as well. And also in a number of the podcasts, we talk about inclusive education on the ground in our schools. So there's a nice kind of complement of different angles in the way we talk about it. I also think it'll be of benefit to teachers working in mainstream education, but also to parents and to students as well. We'll be able to kind of, gain insight into this research area. So I also wanted to give an overview of the podcast process, because I've been on a really steep learning curve over the past few months. I've had a very interesting few months in that I got to meet and had really interesting conversations. So personally, I learned an awful lot. But I also learned how running a podcast, maybe some of the pitfalls to avoid for anyone else who might be thinking about it. But I don't think we can talk about this without talking about it. It is a feature of lockdown. And we were all forced home back in the spring. And I thought, like many others, maybe a new idea of doing what we do on a day-to-day basis differently. So it definitely came from that time period. I sat down at that time and I put my thinking cap on and thought, okay, so what do we want this podcast to be about? And decided to keep it quite general, quite broad. How can we achieve inclusive education? But also looking at the podcast interviewees have huge expertise doing empirical research from pretty much all over the world. So how can we kind of gather evidence around the evidence base for inclusion? I also, during this time, and I think this wouldn't have happened without the pandemic, really, was I reached out to, there wasn't really a scientific process to who I approached. They were people that I've been reading for years and years who've really informed my own work. Who I'm now getting to read as part of programs that I'm running here in college. And I kind of thought that maybe 50% would come back and maybe I'd go out and try and approach a few more. Everybody that I emailed came back. And I'm genuinely grateful for that, because they came back with enthusiasm about what a great idea it was and how they'd be happy to contribute and give up their time. So it kind of warms my heart to think there's such a good-willed community of people out there working on this topic. And I think there are people who have shaped, our education systems and will continue to do so, I've no doubt. I got advice at this point as to how to do a podcast, because this is the part that makes me nervous, the technology side. How do I go about it? So I reached out to people here in Trinity, and Zoom was suggested rather than get too sophisticated as a platform. So we used Zoom primarily. It's 20 to 25 minutes in length, I was advised to do. I used the skills of my 9-year-old son, who builds forts with duvet covers, to, record some of the material, because it's supposed to capture the sound as best you can. So all sorts of skills in the house were utilized in order to create the best audio quality. I also was advised at this time to contact a podcast company. So I went to Headstuff, as a Dublin-based Irish company, and they have kind of held my hand through the whole process of what to do, what not to do. And I went into their studio to record a few bits and pieces as well. So they were excellent and have edited the podcasts, and they're going to release them for me. As you know, Julie Allan's podcast is released today as of 4 p.m, I believe. And I will be releasing them week by week until the end of February, taking a little break over the Christmas period. So that's kind of the podcast process, if you like. So for those of you that don't know the podcast interviewees, this is them. I think I'm covering them here with our images on the right hand side. So Michael and Jayanthi, apologies. So a number of these podcast interviewees are here today. We have Professor Julie Allan, Professor Sheila Riddell, Professor Michael Shevlin, Professor Jayanthi Narayan, and Professor Richard Rose. And I believe Professor Lani Florian is delayed, but is hoping to attend later on in the session. For those of you that don't know, the interviewees are from pretty much all over the world. We have a Canadian perspective, Australian perspective, Indian perspective, but also for our European and UK colleagues, many of them have worked in different national contexts. So throughout the course of the podcast, we get quite an insight into what's going on in other countries, which is really, really good. And I think overall, it'll be an interesting kind of way to get an understanding of how inclusive education has changed over time. And I think that's what each of them, I opened up most of the podcasts into that process. And I think by looking back, we can kind of certainly gain a lot as to where we're going to go forward. So I really would like to thank you all for participating in this. Again, I really, really appreciate it. And I think it's a huge contribution that we're creating between us to do that. So I'm going to call on you now, if that's okay, maybe just speak for a couple of minutes about, I sat down and I thought, what are the overarching themes that cross-cut through all 11 or 12 podcasts that have been undertaken, and many of the themes arose again and again. A number of my students, I used the podcasts on a number of my programs for this semester, and they also did this exercise. It formed part of their assessment. It's me and them are the only people that have heard all of the podcasts so far, and these were the themes that really arose for them. So Michael, do you mind if I call on you first? You spoke a little bit with me about changing systems and mindsets and kind of rigidity of existing systems, but also if you want to add a comment on your experience of doing a podcast as well, it might be interesting.
Thanks, Joanne, and thanks to everybody for attending today. And I was fascinated by the whole idea of doing a podcast, not having done one before. And I don't know why you were worried, Joanne, that there wouldn't be people responding. Don't you know, we always love to talk and to listen, hopefully, to other people as well. I suppose just reflecting on Ireland, almost as a case study, I think, special education has had quite a marginalized place for over many, years, going right back. And then, in a way, without ever really interrogating what was happening there, it became grafted onto our existing education system. And then in many ways, this then was meant to produce kind of an inclusive system. And I think there's obviously real difficulties with that. And I think we've experienced some of those. And I think that would be common internationally as well. We've come quite late to some of these processes. So while there have been very discernible improvements in terms of resourcing, which actually were retained and expanded during the economic recession, which was certainly an achievement, and I think many other parts of the infrastructure that we need to develop inclusive approaches, some of those have been put in place. And yet we constantly hear teachers don't feel empowered, they don't feel capable. Yet we often hear, questions around school capacity. And you begin to wonder, why is that? And with all this increased resourcing, and you often think, have we started in the right place? And often what we, my view, and as many others, I'm sure, is that it appears as though we're always responding to the latest gap that's emerged, and so whether that's children on the ASD spectrum, and we had quite a checkered history with these young people. They weren't recognized as separate condition until 1998. And there was a reluctance to actually engage what did these young people need to thrive and to benefit from an education. And so we have, each time, almost each 4 or 5 years or less than that, there was a new example of marginalization or discrimination appearing, whether that was restricted timetables or the total emphasis on having special classes, which often were an administrative convenience because they were easy to deliver that as a resource. But there wasn't really much thinking around, well, how should these operate? How could these children be fully part of every school? And so while each new school had to have an autism unit, in inverted commas, sometimes there were separate parking spaces and entrances. And some of these doors, as we also found, Joanne, between the special unit and the school were locked. So these were all, I think, issues that emerged. And I would suggest it's because maybe we needed to have a fundamental rethink, and possibly still do. And this is very much in the context now of, the consultation around the New Brunswick model from Canada that has emerged. And I just think so much of what we do, because we've come from a special education perspective, is about emphasizing the differences that these children have, in inverted commas. And so even the assessment process, the consequent labeling, the diagnosis, and even the interventions, which are often maybe more nuanced versions of existing interventions when children have difficulties in learning, become so different and so special that there's a mystique attached to it, and classroom teachers or subject teachers feel, oh, I don't know if I could ever do that. Whereas maybe we need to start thinking, and I know I'm not saying that we don't need some specialist knowledge, you know, but I don't think we need as much as we think we need to actually develop inclusive classrooms. And to me, all children need strengths-based approaches. Every single child in every school needs that. Every child needs an individual plan. Doesn't have to be incredibly detailed, but at least a way, and that they can participate in, so they can begin to identify what they're learning, when they're not learning, and why that is. So you begin to empower children at a very, very young age, and you build that up right through the whole thing, the whole system. And, you know, as an example, like, all children need to belong. So what does the school need to be like? What do teachers need to be like? What do SNAs need to be like? What does the secretary of the school need to be like? So, you know, you can tell very quickly, do children feel that they belong? And that's the same for every child. And the work that I'm principally involved in at the moment is in the Trinity Centre for People with Intellectual Disabilities. And it really has given me a lot of insights, even more so, into these young people that are really labelled as learning failures because they haven't achieved at the same level as everybody else. And some of them haven't achieved official certification at all. And yet, we spend most of the first year dealing with the anxiety attached to being a learning failure. They identify as being, learning failures. And so gradually, as they become more confident in learning and experience success in learning, things begin to change. And there is a kind of transformation takes place. But I think this could take place. It wouldn't need to be as much as we have to do to kind of address that kind of issue. And when I see that, and when you hear their voice about what they feel, how they feel about those experiences, and you kind of know, we can do this better. It's not rocket science.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Michael, thanks so much. That's going to lead us very nicely in. Sheila, I might ask you next to talk about, we talked at the very end of our podcast interview about your piece of work that you're undertaking at the moment around children's rights and inclusive education. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? You need to unmute your mic there.
Okay, so I have just finished, and I'm in the course of writing up a project which is really focusing on children's rights in the light of the UNCRC and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So up until now, the focus has really been, in Scotland and in England, on the rights of parents rather than the rights of children and young people. And recent legislation in both England and Scotland has really put children's rights at the forefront. In the words of one of the policy documents in England, making children the authors of their own lives. So the question that we were really asking is, what does this mean in practice? Is anything changing on the ground? And indeed, what might be the downsides as well as the upsides in placing such a big focus on children's autonomy? What are the implications for children and indeed their families who are living with social disadvantage, children with very significant disabilities, who may have a great deal of difficulty in understanding what the options for their current education and their future education actually are. The work has been done with Neville Harris, who works in the School of Law at the University of Manchester. And it was a really interesting joint piece of working between somebody who's a legal expert and myself, definitely not a legal expert, because the whole area of autonomy crops up, not just in education now, but also in health, in all areas of social policy. The study actually made a comparison between England and Scotland, because interestingly, Scotland has gone much further than other countries in Europe, I would say, in terms of promoting children's rights. And the Scottish government is now completely committed to the incorporation of the UNCRC into all domestic legislation. I think it's the first European country to do that. So now, for example, Scottish children may take their own case to a tribunal if they are not satisfied with the education that they are receiving. This is an absolutely major right to access a legal process. In England, the rights don't go nearly as far as this. So it's only young people who can be the party in a legal dispute. And there are many other examples which we go into in the research about how Scotland has actually gone further. But what we've actually found is that in Scotland, despite the promises of a revolution, and the word revolution is used in policy documents, it tends to be more of the same rather than massive radical change. And this is partly because everything is done in a fairly unregulated way in Scotland. So statutory support plans are scarcely used in Scotland anymore. In England, the rights agenda since the 80s onwards has been stronger rather than the needs agenda. And as a result, even though the legal rights are not quite as far-reaching as in Scotland, because of the more formal processes, children have statutory rights to be more closely involved. So there are many interesting things. And I would say what the challenge is A, thinking through the implications of autonomy. And secondly, or B, thinking through the relationship between the discourse and the practice. Because sometimes I think we assume that if the discourse changes, the practice on the ground changes. And our research shows very clearly that that's not necessarily the case.
Brilliant. Sheila, thank you so much for that insight. I look forward to the publication. I know it's out now, is that right? Is this in November you mentioned?
Yeah, the book is just about to come out actually, but we do have quite a lot of papers and you can see them all on our website anyway.
Thank you so much. Julie, can I call on you next? Because we covered quite a lot in our podcast. When I listened back to it, I realized we really covered quite a few issues, but the topic I pulled for you in terms of what we could talk about maybe today was the challenges and dilemmas in inclusive education. And I know they've come up even already as this conversation is emerging.
They have, Joanne, and I was really thrilled to be part of this podcast. As Michael says, we do like to talk, but this was an exciting and innovative idea. I'm even more thrilled to hear that you've forced your students already to sit and listen and try to make sense of our meanderings. But that's a great thing to have done, and it will be great if we can hear from some of the students today. And the other thrilling aspect of this series is that all my old friends are on there. Probably I should say less of the old, but it's great to see my many favourite scholars and academics speaking and contributing to this. And yes, we had a great conversation, and hats off to you, Joanne, for the way that you conducted it as a lovely conversation. And we did touch, as you say, on the challenges and dilemmas in inclusive education. And I think there are many, but chief of them across the world is the fact that we are part of a system, an education system, whereby, as McDermott says, everyone has to do better than everyone else. So that kind of competition brings with it accountability and regimes of testing and surveillance that make it really difficult for schools and teachers to be inclusive. They place an awful lot of pressure on schools and teachers. But the good news, I think, is that these challenges can be overcome. And in my particular podcast, I was able to talk about a success story, if you like, in Sweden, which took itself from the bottom of the league tables to the top through inclusive education. And they found, just as Michael says, inclusive education isn't about intensive expertise and intensive specialism. It's about teachers wanting every single child in the classroom to succeed and making sure that they tailor their teaching and support to the individual needs of children. So in our research, we spoke to the children along the way and as they went on to high school in all parts of Sweden. And the students were clear that it was really about teachers who loved them enough to make them want to be included and to succeed. So I think that's really good news. And the other good news relates to those children and young people, and it's that they get inclusive education. They get the point of being taught together with people who are different in terms of ability, ethnicity, interests, and so on. And so in the Swedish research, and in all of my research that I've been doing for many, many years, children and young people say, this is the way we have to be educated. We have to be part of an inclusive system. So I think there are lots of reasons to be optimistic, but I think we've got a long way to go. And I think this podcast series is a great way forward, because it's potentially changing the conversation, it's widening the conversation, and it's bringing more people in to that conversation.
Brilliant.
So thanks, Joanne.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Julie. That's really good synopsis of our conversation. I'm going to move now to Professor Jayanthi Narayan. Jayanthi's in India, but she's visiting professor in the University of Northampton. Jayanthi, we spoke a little bit about the barriers to implementing inclusive systems and looking at the Indian context. Do you want to talk a little about that?
Yeah. Congratulations, Joanne, for this launching the podcast, which is a wonderful thing. And listening to the experts who have been talking till now, I see I am in the middle of such experts in the field whose writings I've been reading, but seeing them for the first time. And I'm proud to be part of this group. And thank you for this opportunity to be with all of you. And thanks to Professor Richard Rose for connecting me to you so that I'm here with you all today. And yes, we did talk about the barriers that we've been facing in India in terms of inclusive systems, but we also talked about the Indian culture by itself. India is an inclusive society since BC era. If you look at the history of India, people with special needs or people with disabilities always lived with families. Whatever is the little resources the family might have, it is always shared with the person with disabilities. And therefore, the society had been an inclusive society from the beginning. There's never been a movement to segregate persons with disabilities from the society, and then later efforts towards integration. But what has happened in the recent years is that the acts and policies, they were living, but part of the society, some taken care of, some may not be taken care of because there was no governing acts and policies at that point of time. But now in the later part of 20th century, say from 1980s onwards, we have acts and policies in place which give a right to persons with disabilities. Therefore, there's a paradigm shift from charity to right. The charity mode changed to the rights mode. In fact, India was one of the earliest countries to ratify the UN CRPD to align our 1995 Act on Rights of Persons with Disability to the revised one of 2016 with the UN CRPD alignment done to it. And then the Right to Education Act came into picture, where every child has the right to education. And therefore, the efforts towards inclusion became a focused effort. Till then, there were special schools. When I was a student of special education, say 4.5 decades back, it was segregated education or special schools that was the focus, and special teachers, special education, and that's the way to go, was how it was at that point of time. But now, the inclusive education has got a focus, and access to education for all children in the country has also become a focus area from the central government, centrally implemented scheme, that is centrally sponsored scheme implemented by the state governments all over the country as a right to education. So this is a very big change that I'm seeing in my lifetime. And also the National Education Policy 2020, which is just out, talks about the flexibility in the educational system, and therefore it would allow for children having special education needs to perhaps learn the way they will be able to learn, rather than going in the rigid system of curriculum coverage and examinations, where definitely children with intellectual impairment currently are facing difficulties. So that's another thing that is happening. So the right-based society and persons with special needs have started to self-advocate. This is another major thing that has happened, rather than keeping quiet. And the hurdle, when we come to that, what are the barriers when you're asking? Number one, which you are proud of, I would say, the varied socio-cultural, economic, linguistic, geographical factors that we have in the country. If you look at our currency, take it out and see the currency. In 16 languages, you will see the denomination written of that note. So these are the officially recognized languages, and we have other languages. So when we come to school education, it is governed by Central Board of Education, state boards of education, and then the international boards. One can choose the school that you want to go to, and they have their own syllabus, though there is a minimum levels of learning that is prescribed. These boards are different, and they have their own systems of working. And then the medium of instruction, state board mostly tend to have the state English medium with state language as a second language, or vice versa. It can be either way, the choice of the student that it is. So many languages there. And then the private versus public schools. So the cost of education. So pulling all of these together to come towards implementing inclusive education is something we have not given up. If I would say it very optimistically, we are doing it, and the Indian government is doing it. It's best to bring about the rules and regulations in such a manner so that all the schools, irrespective of all these factors, will be able to implement. Another thing that we look at is the inclusion versus inclusive education. See, the inclusive education is funded by the Department of Ministry of Education, whereas the special schools are funded by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment in our country, and both are going parallelly. So it is the parents' choice to decide whether they would like their child to go to a special school or an inclusive school. Though inclusion is encouraged, we find many a times the parents, particularly those with the developmental disabilities, prefer to send children to the special schools where they believe the safety and security of the child is better, and small group of children under one teacher, so the child gets the best. So many parents tend to prefer that, and the Social Justice Ministry supports and funds those schools. Both are happening, and yeah, the appropriate education, if you want to say, whatever is seemingly appropriate to the child tends to get. And so when you say inclusion, the special schools also aim at preparing the children to be part of the society, included when they are adults, into the in the job market, in their living condition, whatever, they're included. And the school works towards including them, not essentially through the inclusive education classroom situation. So this is one concept that seems to be convincing. And there are very many who have been out of special schools in the society, in the community, working now, included and living well. So yeah, the barriers that I had told, and also the kind of solutions we are looking forward to. Recently, Richard and I are in a project where we are trying to see the policy and practice gaps currently happening. And this was something, the medium of instruction versus the private versus public school versus the government versus state board schools. So many permutation combinations, we had to kind of bring them in order to work. And it's nice. I like the variety that we have, and I also like the way we are challenged, but we are moving forward. And I think, thank you for the opportunity, Joanne, to share the situation in India. And once again, congratulations on your good work.
Thank you, Jayanthi, and thank you. It was really lovely to hear the Indian perspective in your podcast, and also to see that there's quite a few parallels with other national contexts, and that the issues that you describe are pretty universal in many ways, in the tensions and the dilemmas that we're experiencing. So thank you, and it was lovely chatting with you. I'm just going to move on to Richard. Is Richard here?
Hi, Joanne, I'm here.
You are. I just can't see you. Oh, you are. You're there. Sorry. Richard, lovely to see you again. In our podcast, Richard, we talked a little bit about inclusion policy and the kind of transferability of that policy. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, or anything else that you think we discussed that was interesting?
Yes, thank you very much, Joanne. It's first of all, I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity, and like everybody else here, I think we're in awe of the way that you've got about bringing people together for this kind of discussion, and it's going to be useful to many of us in a lot of different contexts. So thank you very much for that for a start. And very interesting to come a little bit down the line, having heard other people, and being able to appreciate the ideas that they've brought to the table, and to be sat here nodding in agreement with much of what I've heard. When we had our podcast, you were particularly interested, I think, in the whole notion of inclusion in a range of contexts. And we had quite an interesting discussion, I think, about the difficulties that sometimes exist in what I would call transferability of ideas. We're very aware, I think, that inclusion is a word that has been used widely around the world, and that we know that the many initiatives and policies and international agreements from Salamanca right the way up through the development goals, education for all, etc., Incheon, and all these other agreements have had influence across the world. And I would say in our discussion, we felt that those influences were, generally speaking, positive. They've brought attention to the fact that we do have marginalized peoples. We have children who've been excluded from the education system. But I think beyond that, one of the concerns I have is this notion that we can simply transfer ideas from one culture to another and expect people to move at a pace towards what we see as an inclusive education system. And I think we need to be very respectful of the way that education systems have developed in different countries. We just heard, for instance, from my good friend Jayanthi, from whom I've been learning so much in recent years, you know, over the years that I've been working in India. And we need to recognize that history is very important within all this. And I think it's important in two respects. As Jayanthi has just told us, the family structures, the community structures in India have had an approach to caring for those who might have been, in our own Western cultures, very often put away, put out of sight for many, many centuries. And that's a situation that is born out of both philosophy and religion, but also out of necessity in a country as diverse as India, I think. And I sometimes parallel this with some of the things that have happened in inclusion in our own history. And Michael spoke a little bit earlier about this dilemma about the special schools, for instance. In my own country here in the UK, we've had a long history of exclusion of children from school. We have to remember it was only the 1971 Education Act that first gave every child the right to go to school in this country. Mm. And those who were previously classed with terrible titles like mentally handicapped, for instance, a terrible term, were not actually entitled to education as such until 1971. And then we had this development of special schools. And I would suggest to you that many of the people who were at the forefront of inclusive education were people who'd come through a special education background. Mm. Many of our colleagues, including some who were involved in these podcasts, had a background of working in special education and then began to develop their ideas and thinking about how the kind of principles of pedagogy, the rights issues, etc., could be brought together to move towards a more inclusive education system. And one of the things we talked about, which I've considered a lot, is how important that history was to where we are today, and the dangers we have of now taking where we are today and anticipating that people in some other countries may be able to jump all those stages that we went through, from not being in school at all to inclusion. Mm. Whereas I think that may be, in some instances, a very difficult concept. I think the other thing we talked about, which relates to this, which I feel quite strongly about, and again, you know, Jayanthi mentioned that we've been working together in some village communities, for instance, in India, and that is the importance of understanding the needs, the anxieties, and the desires of families who have children who haven't been to school. First generation learners, children with disabilities, those who have not yet found a footing in the education system. And they're very anxious about the kind of experience that their children are going to have when they go into an education system that is already very well established. And I think we need to be very respectful of those apprehensions they have and to listen to them and to work alongside them in order to ensure that what we're doing is not imposing our own view of the world upon these families and their children. I mean, I'm always very conscious of the fact that I come from a country that has a long history of imperialism and imposing systems on other countries. And we need to be mindful of the fact that we have got to allow other people to take a lead in the change they want, rather than, if you like, imposing our experience and expertise upon them. I think Julie Allan made some particularly important points here. I made a couple of notes about Julie's comments, and you know, her points about a competitive education environment are extremely important. We know that competition within education has been detrimental in many senses. You know, education has become seen as something where success is managed and is recorded, if you like, in academic terms. And my work with Michael on Project Iris tried to address this issue, that there are other aspects of education that are important. But I also feel we need to be aware that there is almost a kind of international competition in terms of becoming inclusive. And I'm sometimes saddened when people I've worked with in India, in Cambodia recently, have actually used words to me saying things like, well, we're behind you in terms of where we are for inclusion. We're playing catch up to catch up with you. And I worry about some of that language and the way that it's being used and interpreted as if there is an ultimate goal, and we're all going towards that same ultimate goal without recognizing that there are different paths that we can use to actually get there. So I think there are a lot of important issues in terms of what we've learned in countries where we've been trying to address this issue for so long, and the same arguments have been rehearsed over and over again, in terms of our understanding of how we use that knowledge in a respectful manner when working with other people. And I'd just like to finish by saying there are two other important points for me here, and both Michael and Jayanthi have mentioned these. Michael is doing incredible work in terms of what happens after statutory school leaving age has been attained. And we need to be very cautious. I've met young people in my own country and elsewhere who feel they were well respected in school and got the benefit of an inclusive education. And when they've left school, they found society is still hard, and they've not necessarily had the opportunities that they had hoped for and deserve. And, a similar point, Jayanthi asked the question, what happens after education? Inclusion isn't just an education matter. Inclusion is a tremendous force for change, but change isn't going to come about unless those of us in education work in partnership with others in other disciplines, and particularly with families and young people on the ground. So thank you for giving us this opportunity, Joanne. I think there's a lot for us to debate here. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for that, Richard. That was really, really great. Thanks a lot. Lani, I see you've joined us, and thanks for doing so. In our podcast, Lani, we talked a little bit about teacher education and professional development to some extent, but just teacher empowerment more generally. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, or anything else that cropped up in our interview?
Thank you, Joanne. And I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to get here early enough to hear my colleagues speak. Although, Richard, it was just great to hear you say hopefully most of what you had to say. And I think I can maybe start by, saying how much what I heard of what you said really resonated with me and some of the things that I've been thinking about myself. So this is a time of reflection, I think, for all of us, regardless of which area or aspect of the field that that our research is addressing. For myself, in recent years, I've been very much focused on really trying to learn from all of the work that we and most of you have been doing in trying to understand this contested concept of inclusive education and how it's enacted in different cultures and contexts, and really trying to say, what is it that we can learn from this, body of work that's been ongoing now for quite a few years? And more importantly, can we theorize it in ways that will be useful and helpful to the new generation of teachers who are coming through? So this idea of how we theorize the lessons learned from the work that our generation has been involved in over the years, and reflect it back to the new generation of teachers who are coming through, taking account that we are living in a time of incredible uncertainty, and some of the things that we have been experiencing, particularly this year with all of the disruptions for schooling, are making all of us think about the way that we do our work, and then what that means for the preparation of teachers who will be working with these hybrid models that we're all struggling to get our heads around these days. So for me, some of those lessons and some of the things that I think that we need to be taking account of is how we take a values-based approach like inclusive education and be able to distill those principles, embed them in our teacher education programs, particularly for mainstream classroom teachers, in ways that will resonate with them and their practice, in ways that will make them feel that this is work that they are qualified to do, that they have the capacity to do, that much of what they do now is not far off of where we're asking them to be, but that there are some barriers that have to be broken down, and that they have a role to play in helping us do that, whether that's at the level of their individual practice or through the advocacy that they do, or just simply in the ways that they hold themselves professionally, their professional standing and stature. So for me, I think that this notion that we have all in some ways acknowledge that, teachers say they're not qualified to do this work, and we've got some, ideas about why they feel that way. Partly that have to do with the structure of schooling and the structure of teacher education. When we, prepare teachers to work for different qualifications that say that they're qualified to work with different types of learners, then we are basically also telling them that there are other types of learners that they're not qualified to teach with. And then we spend a lot of time wondering why inclusion is so difficult in schools. So breaking down that barrier within universities and other providers now, in terms of how we think about what is every teacher's responsibility and every teacher's role in providing a meaningful educational experience for any learner and every learner, is really important. And I think that that idea that we have a responsibility to do that is one of those common values that we can look at in terms of how we embed that in every kind of teacher education program that we have. So I've been thinking a lot about those kinds of situations, and also many of you who will have read my work and heard me speak will know something I feel quite strongly about is it's not so much what we do, but how we do it. I think that there are many ways that we can do things in the name of inclusive principles or practices that are actually a reproduction of exclusion, and that there are other ways that we could take those same practices but enact them in ways that are quite faithful to a principled approach to inclusion, where the outcome is a meaningful educational experience for a child, and their participation in a community, a classroom community. So I'm going to stop there, Joanne. I think that hopefully summarizes a lot of what I went into in the podcast in a lot more detail, but it's really great to be part of this series.
Thank you, and thank you for being part of it. And we did go into this in quite some detail. So for those interested, they'll certainly be interested in your episode. We have like a couple of minutes for questions or comments. Anne, I know you've been keeping an eye on the comment or chat box there. Is there anything that's come through?
Yeah. So there were a couple of questions relating to I suppose to that idea of discourse and names, I suppose, and I'll just read two of them. So from Anne Margaret Smith, she said, I'm interested in Sheila Riddell, Sheila's comment about the discourses of inclusive education and their effect on practice. I wonder how the panelists feel about the special education terminology, whether they've any suggestions for alternatives and how we might promote those alternative discourses. And I'll just read the second one because they're quite related, from Catherine Merrigan. I noted a particular phrase which Professor Jayanthi used when describing inclusion and inclusive education. She mentioned the parallel system of special schools versus inclusive schools. From my own research, many special schools would describe themselves as inclusive schools and often more inclusive than mainstream schools in terms of meeting the diverse needs of students. I believe that is a fundamental understanding that is our fundamental understanding of the concept of inclusion and inclusive education, which needs to be explored, in particular from the special school perspective. She's really looking forward to the podcast series. So I think maybe that issue around how we name things might be something that would be useful to discuss.
Does anybody want to take that?
Should I say something very briefly about the discourse? I think it was Gillian Fulcher who talked about the slippery nature of discourses in this area. And inclusive education is such a vague concept. It can be used to describe almost anything. So I have the feeling that we need to keep a sense of space, physical space, as being quite important here. I was really interested in what Michael had to say about Ireland looking at the New Brunswick model, which I think implies having children, Michael, you tell me if I'm wrong, but having children all the time in mainstream classrooms as the ultimate in inclusive education. And we've had a completely different view, really, from Jayanthi, who's talking about Indian parents' preference for special, separate settings, partly because of the perceived inadequacy of mainstream schools, or the refusal of mainstream schools to accept children with disabilities. So I think we have to be clearer about what inclusive education is and what it isn't. But by that, I don't think we need to, my personal view again would be that we shouldn't say all children have to be in mainstream schools all the time, because personally, I don't know of any place where that has worked for all children all the time. For example, in secondary schools, comprehensive schools, for a child with very severe autistic spectrum disorder, having to move along very crowded corridors from one class to another every hour or something might be an extremely disturbing experience and not one they actually want to do at all. So clarity about the concept, but also some degree of understanding about where mainstream education is the right thing for a child and where it might not be for specific reasons.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sheila. Is there anything else there, Allan? Just conscious of time, so
Yeah, sure. So Maeve O'Regan has a very kind of a very particular question, or a very direct question. So do the panelists have any suggestions on supporting the more social side and belonging aspects of inclusion for children and young people alongside their academic development? Will I read the questions that are there, and then you can come in on all of them with that?
Well,
oh, Michael,
I'm happy just to respond to that very quickly. I think it is about thinking, how does every child belong? And I know a school where a principal in a primary school, they put up a big net across the playground, and one half was for noisy play, group play, running about, wrecking the place. And the other side was for children who preferred something quieter, who preferred to, and there were little benches and there were other stuff. And I just thought, now that was a real example of inclusive thinking, that there were many ways in which children play, and that it wasn't just presumed that because there was a yard there, that that was the only way. The other thing that he did was he got a bus stop, literally, from Dublin Bus. And any child who didn't have someone to play with could stand at the bus stop and they'd be picked up, and there were trained mentors. And some of the kids who were seen as having special education needs were among the mentors. So it wasn't as if it was one child doing something for somebody else, but just the concept that thinking really is about how it is. And in another school, they found that the children were not playing together very well. There were lots of rows and arguments. So they went back to an awful lot of traditional games, that's hopscotch and all kinds of things, which you can get your mum and dad or granny or granddad to explain what that was. But the idea was that it was all about turn taking and cooperation. So it's about the thinking and about looking at the spaces and not letting those determine what, you know, almost predetermine what you're going to do.
Can I just endorse that, Anne? I think, is my microphone on?
It is, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so, you know, I just think that that was a really great example that Michael gave us. And, you know, I think Michael and Richard, based on, you know, just the work that you've done on listening to pupils, would also, you know, sometimes it's just a matter of asking pupils. Like, you can do a lot to enhance participation and belonging by just asking children, how do we make sure everyone can participate in this lesson or this activity? And they will usually come up with all kinds of really interesting and creative solutions to that question just by the teacher or, the adult in the room giving the prompt. So just wanted to endorse what Michael said, but, and add this prompting as a suggestion to extend that.
Thanks, Lani. I'm just going to say, I'm going to go read the other questions, and we're conscious we're a little bit past 5. So for those of you who need to leave at 5, by all means do, but we're just going to, because there's a couple of people with some nice questions here that I think would be useful to just talk about for a moment. So we have Niamh Rogers, who's saying, I found the podcast really interesting, and as a form, basically an alternative form to journals and texts, which can be kind of cumbersome. So that's great, Niamh, that you found them valuable like that. Olive Healy is just saying, thanks for sharing all your insights, and I'm interested in hearing your views on what knowledge and practices of evidence-based educational practices are necessary to support inclusion of children who have complex educational needs. And why are many educational practices, which are evidence-based, not used in classrooms? For instance, direct instruction methods ensure that all children in a group instruction format have an opportunity to respond, yet this practice is not well known or well utilised in Ireland in any case. And we also have a question regarding school leadership, which is, what would be the panelists' perspectives on how school leaders can facilitate and embed and sustain cultures of inclusion, and that's from Joanne Narayan. So 2 quite different questions there. But
could I answer the last one on leadership and tie it to the previous question and answers from both Michael and Lani? I think it's really important to encourage leaders to make explicit the goals of belonging and inclusion, and recruit the whole community to work on that task of creating a belonging environment. And we can dress it up in technical language or theoretical language using something like social capital. And we can say we're actually seeking to build capital among our students in the form of relationships with one another, and to build up their skills in interacting with one another. So I think leaders need to be encouraged to make that part of their aims and ambitions for the school. And in the podcast, I talked about Sweden, as I mentioned, but it was largely down to the leader and his emphatic declaration that this was an inclusive school and they would work on the social relations and the belonging of the children.
Thanks for that, Julie. Very interesting there about the role that leaders can play in this. And I wonder, would anyone like to come in on Olive's question just around, I suppose the fundamental question there is, why are evidence-based practices not more in use in classrooms?
I can have a go at that question. Unless someone else would also like to come in, because I've already used up some of this Q&A time.
Go for it, Lani.
Okay, thank you. I worry a little bit about this why don't teachers make use of evidence-based practices question in general, in part because a lot of times there are practices that are recommended in the literature that may have come from a special education tradition or may have come from an educational psychological learning theory kind of position that are very elegant and, I'm going to use the word effective in inverted commas, but their transferability to the hurly-burly of a busy, diverse classroom with a lot of things happening at once is not really been adequately addressed. And I've always been persuaded by my colleague Donald McIntyre's comment that we've asked the wrong question. That teachers don't make use of some of these evidence-based practices because they're not relevant to the context in which they're doing the work, that there are implementation issues there that researchers haven't addressed. And if teachers see the evidence-based practice as another job on top of everything else that they're doing, we're going to have the theory practice gap. that we need to be rethinking and reframing how we communicate that knowledge and help teachers to embrace it and work with it in ways that support what they're already doing, instead of kind of demonizing them for not doing a better job than they are, because they're neglecting to implement something that may be quite difficult to implement in the classroom. And that's not to make excuses for teachers who could be using practices that they're not using, so much as to say that that's a pretty complex question and we need to look at both sides of that.
I think most of the comments here now are essentially lots of thanks. Thanks to everyone for whetting my appetite for more, and definitely we'll follow up with the podcast from Denise Kelly and Margaret Flood, just saying thank you for sharing all your thoughts this evening, and important conversations that we need to have, and looking forward to listening to the podcast. So everyone's really very grateful. It was really interesting listening to you. I'll hand over to you, Joanne, to close things off, but thanks so much.
Thanks a million for that, Anne, because it's lovely to get a bit of feedback from who's here. So thanks for all those comments, everybody. And one of my students did speak, so thanks for that as well. So I just put up a list here. This is the schedule that we have, and this is on the School of Education website for anyone that's going to follow the podcast, but we'll probably, social media is probably the best way to get this out. So each week I'll release it on my own account, and the School of Education will as well. So that's the schedule, and then this is where to find them on the School of Education website, and my own academic website will have it on bankoninclusion.com as well. But it's wherever you get your podcasts. It's what they always say on podcast apps. That's where this is too. So hopefully we'll get a nice conversation started. I'd really like to thank the panelists for coming here today, and the broader group of interviewees that agreed to this podcast, because none of this would happen without you guys. So thank you very much, and thanks for those who attended this afternoon as well. And Anne, thank you for putting all this on as well. Cheers, thank you. Bye everyone.
Thank you, and it wouldn't have happened without you, Joanne.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much.